Hey guys, welcome to the third video for chapter 32, and in this one we're going to be talking about conflict in the Middle East. Now, conflict in the Middle East unfortunately go hand in hand in the modern era. For the later part of the 20th century and certainly every bit of the 21st century so far, the Middle East has been a very, very conflicted area to say the least. It's an area we associate with civil war. It's an area we associate with extremism and terrorism. So it's certainly not an area that's high on anybody's vacation spots. In chapter 32, we discussed how some of the conflicts in the Middle East began. And in this video, we're going to go a bit more into depth and detail with them. So let's first talk about what is probably the most complex and complicated one there, and that's Israel versus Palestine. Back in chapter 31, we talked about how Israel became a nation in 1948 and how it immediately created problems with its Arab neighbors in the Middle East. Right? All of the green shaded countries here are countries that are either pretty much completely Arab or have a sizable Arab population. And you notice here, that little red one is Israel. It is surrounded by Arab neighbors and almost entirely surrounded by Muslim Arab neighbors. So they are not particularly big fans of Israel for the most part. Even the ones that aren't outwardly antagonistic towards Israel, they're not allies with them. Okay, so Israel has no real friends or allies in the area. It fought a war against most Arab nations in the region, such as Jordan, Syria, Egypt, and Iraq, literally the first year of its existence. In 1948, it comes into being. In 1948, it fights its first war. Surprisingly, it won the war, but it would go to war several more times with its Arab neighbors. The most, hold on one sec, let me just get rid of this thing. There we go. Now, these wars resulted in Israeli expansion of territory. This was mostly a result of the War of 1967. Right, so over here you see 1949 and you see what they call the Armistice Line. This area in here, the West Bank, that was controlled by Jordan in 1949. Now you look at 1967. All right, the darker shaded area are lands occupied by Israel in 1967. You've got this area up here, what's called the Golan Heights. You've got the West Bank. You've got the Gaza Strip, and you've got this big area here, the Sinai Peninsula, which was a part of Egypt. So Israel significantly expanded its territory after 1967. Now, this war was followed by another war in 1973, where Israel was attacked on Yom Kippur, which is a high holy day. But Israel was able to hold on to these new territories after that. Now, the two main areas of contention are the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. All right, so that's here and here. These are the two areas that have the most significant Palestinian populations within, quote unquote, Israeli territory. They are often referred to by Palestinians as occupied territories. As occupied territories. Palestinians felt that these lands are rightfully theirs, and Israel illegally occupies them. Israel has encouraged Jewish settlers to move into these areas, and this has caused further bitterness between both sides. We'll talk a little bit more about the settlements later. Now, Palestinian resistance was led by a group called the Palestinian Liberation Organization, otherwise known as the PLO. The PLO started as an extremist group that called for the destruction of Israel. It was led by this guy, Yasser Arafat. Here you see Arafat. He has since passed, but you saw him with his kind of iconic look of the Arab headscarf that he always wore when he would make public appearances. The terrorist statement, he's known as both a freedom fighter and a terrorist, depending on whose point of view. Now, the terrorist part of it is somewhat accurate, as the PLO has engaged in terrorist activity. Probably the most notorious example was the 1972 Olympic Games in Munich, Germany. That was where a group of Palestinian terrorists went into the Olympic Village and kidnapped a group of Israeli athletes and coaches as well. And in the ensuing battle and then later escape attempt ended up murdering a large portion of them. And you see the picture here of the terrorist looking out of the balcony to check on things with the hooded figure, just kind of a very dark and almost evil looking figure. And that became the iconic image of Islamic terrorism, in the later part of the 20th century. Now, Palestinian opposition also appears as intifadas. That translates into uprisings. Okay, so intifadas means uprisings. During intifadas, young Palestinians would attack Israeli troops and engage in terrorist activities that kill civilians. It was meant to try and destabilize Israeli control. Now, all the violence, though, excuse me, doesn't mean that there haven't been attempts at peace. The most notable of these attempts was the Oslo Accords. Now, this was signed by Arafat and Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Here you see them shaking hands with U.S. President Bill Clinton in the middle. And this was signed in 1993, and it gave Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip limited self-rule, so it kind of gave them their own form of government. This peace would not last, though, as violence continued between the two sides. There are a lot of obstacles to peace between both sides, the most prominent one being land claims. Jews claim Israel is their ancestral homeland going back to biblical days. That's a tough claim to talk people out of. Palestinians say that this is all well and good, but they've been living on that land for centuries, so where else can they go? Another obstacle to peace is the Jewish settlements in the West Bank that I mentioned before. Palestinians claim these are illegal, right? So you look at all of them. The darker brown areas are exclusive Palestinian control. You've got the yellow ones, which are joint, and then the white are exclusive Israeli control. And then all of the blue are Israeli settlements. Now, the West Bank is supposed to be for Palestinian settlement, but there have been so much Jewish settlement coming into the West Bank that, as you can see, Israel controls a good bit of it. Palestinians look at this as just being another front onto their sovereign rights, and so, it leads to more resentment and violence. A third obstacle is Jerusalem. Who controls it? Jerusalem is a holy city. Now, you look at the borders here. The kind of the green line here, that is, literally known as the green line that runs through Jerusalem. That splits Jerusalem into east and west. This region over here, East Jerusalem, is in Israel proper. Okay, that is within Israeli territory. The rest of it, this through here, right, that is in the West Bank, and Palestinians claim that as their own. East Jerusalem, kind of is also a site of the old city, a lot of the old holy sites. Now, ultimately, the Israel-Palestine conflict remains one of the most difficult ones to find common ground. Ongoing violence as well as international split over who backs Palestine. This Palestinian terrorism with groups like Hamas that are in control of the Gaza Strip. All of this stuff makes it seem like this is an issue that won't be solved anytime soon. All right, now, some stuff about civil wars. The Israeli-Palestine conflict is far from the only one in the region. Civil wars in neighboring nations have broken out periodically since World War II. One such area is Lebanon. Now, Lebanon is a small country just to the north of Israel, right? So here's Israel, here's Lebanon, okay, on the Mediterranean. And it's a very religiously diverse country. You've got both Sunni and Shia Muslims, as well as the largest Christian population in the Middle East. Now, there was always a somewhat uneasy balance between all the religious groups, okay? They maybe if they didn't love each other, they kind of just lived side by side and got along. This balance was upset by Palestinian refugees that were coming in from Israel into Lebanon in the 1970s, right, after Israel's creation. All of the influx of new Muslims now, that led to religious civil war, which ravaged the country. Christian and Muslim militias attacked one another. And even though peace was established, the destruction was widespread. Beirut for a while was largely considered to be the worst place to live in the world. And Beirut being the capital of Lebanon. And it led to deep divisions, and made creating a very stable government very, very difficult. Now, part of the problem is not just violence in Lebanon, but also violence in Lebanon's neighbor, Syria, which you got here. Syria, like Lebanon, has a diverse population. It's predominantly Muslim, but there are both Sunni and Shiites, as well as numerous ethnicities besides Arab. It's ruled as a dictatorship by this guy, Bashar al-Assad. All right. He actually inherited that from his father. He's opposed Israel and supported terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. Protests against the government in 2010 led to a severe government crackdown in which Assad's forces used lethal force against the protesters. This in turn erupted into civil war, and unfortunately the civil war has created an opening for ISIS to gain a foothold. Now the entire situation is now very, very complicated. You look at a map of Syria here. You've got the kind of the brown areas in control of the Syrian government. You've got Syrian Kurdish forces that are control the north. You've got Syrian rebel forces that are scattered throughout in green. And then you've got the gray areas here of the Islamic State. So you've got so many different forces. You've got different resistant groups. It's really tough to figure out what each one stands for. Plus, nowadays, add in Russia's support for Assad and its involvement there, and you have a very, very thorny international issue. All right, we're going to hold off here for now, and we'll do one more video for this section, for the final one for the chapter, actually, where we'll talk about Iraq.